Thanks for being here in the middle of these funny weeks of May with lots of bank holidays. And thank you to Professor Marie-Catherine Riekhof from the University of Kiel, who's joining us today in our Blue Justice webinar series. And so we'll let Marie-Catherine talk to us about the work that she's been doing in the context of Baltic Sea fisheries and looking at nature's decline and recovery. And I'll pass the floor to you, Marie-Catherine, and thanks again for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Olivier, for this great introduction, and thanks for having me here today. And thanks to all of you for being here in these crazy May days. Yeah, I'll present you some joint work with Frederick Noack, who's at the University of British Columbia in Canada. It's in nature's decline and recovery, and it's in structural change, regulatory cost, and the onset of resource use regulation. And it's a little bit on the Baltic Sea fishery. I mean, there we see this decline in the fish stocks, and we're asking ourselves, will there be a coming back at some point? So here we're looking at it at a broader sense to, or trying to get a broader picture on what could actually help us in thinking about a recovery. So the general motivation for this paper is that, well, we all know that human well-being depends on nature and so many different facets. Basically, it's just like it's feeding us, it's regulating the climate such that we can live in it. We just enjoy it for cultural value. So in the end, it leads to kind of an accelerating use of nature, as we see documented in many different areas. So for example, here you see the Earth system trends. It's just different, yeah, it's carbon dioxide, for example, it's tropical forest loss, and it's the development over time. Yeah, so see always about time, and you see all these uses are basically increasing. Interestingly, if you look at marine fish capture, it's increasing, and then it's kind of leveling off. So I mean, and it's in general, this is this overall trend. So especially, I'm focusing a lot on fisheries today. If we look at these in more detail, this is the picture that we get related to resource extraction over time. So here we see again time scales, and here we see the resource extraction rate in percent, and it's relative to the extraction rates that maximizes long-run harvest. So for those familiar with the fishery terminology, it's related to the maximum sustainable yield. So meaning if we here have 100%, we would be at the maximum sustainable yield level. If we are below, we have a stock at higher levels and an extraction rate that is below this level. And what we see is usually that here the extraction increases over time. Yeah, so that's also what we've seen for the Baltic Sea. You see it's for the biggest fishery nations in the world. So if you see that's for Argentina, it keeps increasing. You see for Indonesia, it's still, it starts relatively low. It just crosses the MSY line. The question is whether it keeps increasing or not. And then for other countries, you see that Japan, it has been increasing, it has been above sustainable levels, but it's like returning to these long-run sustainable levels. And here for Norway, for example, as well, you've seen this period of time where overall the resources have been used at a not sustainable level, but now they're returning to this level. And we're trying to understand a little bit what is driving this. Well, first of all, this overuse. But I think they were quite good at understanding that, but especially why, yeah, when will it return? Why doesn't it return directly? Yeah, so that is the question. What drives this observed pattern of resource use beyond the long run level and this potential recovery? And we're focusing here on an approach where we focus on global fisheries, and we derive two stylized facts that our model that we built to understand this ongoing, that this model should match, so as to ensure that we're close to reality, close to what's going on. Our model is a dual economy model. That means we have two different sectors, one using the resource and the other one as manufacturing, so independent of the resources. And yeah, this is based on the data we're having. We focus here on the production side. So kind of with some, yeah, the economics assumption that in certain cases we can just differentiate the income and the production side from the consumption side and on how things are actually spent. And we focus on the elements of structural technological progress, structural change, and especially endogenous cost regulation. So regulation is costly, and the choice whether to implement is then endogenous. And when we focus on an intertemporal setting, so these are all things that change or may change over time. If we look to the literature, what is already there, I mean, all these kind of with like curvature in the data, especially related to environmental use and the development. We often think of the environmental Kuznets curve literature that relates to externalities, to pollution, but it cannot really be used to explain why we have the substantial economic loss for quite a long time in these countries. And it's the same industry that's causing these economic losses, that's suffering from these losses. So you would think that they kind of find a way of actually dealing with this. We'll have this literature on economic development and technical progress related to sustainable resource use and also to non-sustainable resource use, but there's not so much on nature's recovery. So it's more like on nature's decline. And as one focus is on resource regulation, we also relate to the literature on property rights or this onset of regulation. And so far, it's not so often related to regulatory costs in this dynamic setting. So just to give you an overview, that was kind of my introduction, and kind of to give you an overview where we stand, where I want to go, and kind of what's the general setting here. I want to present you the stylized facts next so that you have a better idea of the data. Then I'll present the model, the results, and end with the discussion and conclusion. So the first stylized facts relate to this interaction between resource extraction and development. So resource extraction first increases and then decreases with economic development. So this is data from quite a lot of fishery stocks, fish stocks, and then GDP data from the World Bank. And again, it's like this rate relative to the rate that maximizes the long run harvest. So 100% would be at this MSY level. So we see it's over, like with GDP per capita, it's cutting over this level. There is this kind of overuse time, but then there seems to be a return to more sustainable levels. So that's the first stylized fact. And the other one is that the number of resource users declines with economic development. So this is often related to structural change. We often see that in agriculture, that when a country becomes richer, less people work in agriculture. And you also see that for fishery. So here you see the GDP per capita, and here you see the fishes per 1,000 inhabitants. And then it's over time between 1995 and 2021. And then here just some countries are highlighted so that you see the development, and it's the log scale. So that explains a little bit this curvature. And you see as countries become richer, the fishes per 1,000 inhabitants goes down. And one note I want to make here, that this means one could always think, well, we have less fishes, so also kind of the fishing capacity goes down. So that kind of, it's good for fishing or for the fish stocks if people are leaving the fishery, but this is not so clear. So just the result of the slide in a nutshell is basically, while the number of vessels declined, the share of large vessels increased. So let me walk you through the slide in some more detail. So here again, you see the development over time. Here you see the number of vessels. And the colors denote the size of the vessels. So the red ones are the large ones, larger than 24 meters. The smaller ones actually, so smaller than 24 meters. And the blue ones down here are the large one, larger than 60 meters. So you see that overall, I mean, over time, the number of vessels goes down. And I mean, you can see by visual inspection, especially from these red bars, they become relatively smaller. And we here with this black line, we depicted the share of vessels larger than 60 meters, and they increase over time. So in the end, it's not clear what that means. Even though we have less people in the fishery and less boats, it may be that just few fishers operate larger boats, so that it's not clear what happens to the fishing capacity. Another figure I want to show relates to the the role of management enforcement, and if we have enforced resource management, that this reduces over extractions. So how do we measure that? And especially here, we already also look at management costs. So we well, let me start again down here. So you see the regulation expenditure. So I mean, we say regulation is costly. So if you really want to change something, it costs money. So regulation costs of the expenditure in US dollar per fisher, you see here. And then you see here the change in overfished stocks, the percentage share. Yeah, and it's the comparison between 2003 and 2012. And overfished here means that the extraction rate is higher than this MSY level. Yeah, so then higher than the 100% I always showed before. So here you see the zero line. So this line, there's no change. You see most dots are below this line, so there's actually a reduction. And the share of overfished stocks, and I mean, for some, there is an increase here. But what you see with this gray line, there's an overall negative relationship. So if you spend more on your regulation, you've reduced the share of overfished stocks. So this is kind of the two stylized facts and some additional data I want to show you to motivate our model. It's a small open economy model. That means prices are fixed when you trade with the international market, with the other countries. You have a local labor market, so it's kind of fixed supply of labor. You have these two sectors. One is the resource sector, one is the manufacturing sector, and non-overlapping periods. Yeah, so one period after the other, and these periods are denoted by T. This constant population size that's connected to this local labor market is termed N bar. And then we have that each individual just has one unit of labor, and she or he can decide at the beginning of each period in which sector to work, so either going fishing or natural resource harvesting, or going to the manufacturing sector. We also have the resource manager, and he or she can decide whether to regulate the resource, and if to regulate the resource, at which level to regulate. So income at the natural resource level is just here, it's the price times the harvest. And then the harvest is just, this is the unit of labor. This is the technology level of the productivity times the resource stock. And then we have exogenous technological progress. So just the productivity or the technology level in the next period is just the current level that is increased by some rate. We have the natural resource dynamics in continuous time. So we have here the change in the stock. It's just intrinsic growth rate times the stock. And this is the logistic term, 1 minus the stock over the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is kind of the maximum of, the largest stock that can be sustained in a certain area, in a certain part of the ocean, in a lake or in a pond. So the idea is if you just have a pond and at some point it's just full, they cannot have an additional fish. So only if one fish dies, another one comes. So then this would be the same size, and this would all turn to be zero. So there would be no additional growth. And again, if there's no stock, there's also no growth. So this is how kind of the resource regenerates, and then we subtract what is harvested. So this is just the overall harvest, and here it's times all the resource users that are harvesting. We choose units such that both is continuous time and so tau here and T or period are measured in the same units. And we focus on fast resource dynamics, meaning that the resource regenerates relatively fast as compared to the technological progress. So we think a little bit of this technological progress that is an investment in a new boat, for example. And the boats usually are way older, the 20 years or even 40 years. So only like at very large intervals to buy a new boat, and then you buy a better boat usually, and like fish, they can grow relatively fast. So this is kind of the comparison that's relevant here. And if we look at this, we kind of say, okay, fish stocks reach their steady state so fast that this adaptation time, we just neglect that and work with the steady state stock. That makes the model analytically tractable. So then you have the stock as just the carrying capacity times this term, where you see the technology level plays a role and the number of resource users. In the manufacturing sector, it's more or less mirrors the resource sector, except there's no resource. You just have the income. It's the price times the productivity level, and the productivity or the technology level grows exogenously. And then we have this, if we have open access, so if there's no regulation, the incomes choose work to work, and they just look at, will my income in the resource sector or in the manufacturing sector be larger? And that's how they decide. And then from this equation, implicitly, we become here the number of resource users under open access, such that each resource user is indifferent between both sectors. But then we may also have the manager there, or at least the manager may decide to regulate. So what is the role? Well, like, what is the decision problem of this manager? So he or she first decides whether to regulate the resource, and then if regulation should be enacted, he or she can decide how many resource users and star to allow. And for this decision, the manager faces different types of regulation costs. One is monitoring cost. So if I say it's only a certain amount of people is allowed, I have to monitor that. The other one is the enforcement cost. So it means I have to, especially when I start this regulation, I have to enforce that not additional people just come in because it's more attractive to be a fisher. So that's why this enforcement cost depends on the number that would prevail under open access. The monitoring cost so that people comply with the rules related to gear, so that this depends on the people actually in the sector. And we have also fixed costs, like setting up everything initially. So, and the regulation is introduced if net benefits are higher than under open access, and the level of regulation or the number of resource users allowed is to maximize net benefits. So just to put it down again, regulation is allowed here when we have with this optimal number of resource users, the net income. So it's kind of the income in the resource sector minus opportunity costs, so working in the other sector, minus costs to monitor the users, minus the enforcement so that no additional users come in, minus fixed cost is larger than what we have as a total income in the sector under open access. So what do we get with the setting? So first of all, there are quite a lot of scenarios that one can consider, and we kind of want to consider focusing more on the structural change issues, starting with an abundant resource. So kind of what we've seen in the data, like at the initial, when the time series started. So we start off from a scenario where all individuals in the resource sector, where the initial resource stock is above the maximum economic yield. So here we're looking at economics and not just the sustainable yield. I mean, for putting that into the just the first consideration, it's sometimes easier just to use just a biological criteria like the maximum sustainable yield, because here we need additional data, and the maximum economic yield would actually lead to a even higher resource stock than under maximum sustainable yield. And we assume identical technological progress in both sectors, based on a paper by Hannesson and colleagues. We assume rather simple cost functions, just linear cost functions, and this gives us the following results. And I don't want to walk you through this. I just want to walk you through these illustrations. So you see here under open access, what happens? Here we have the number of resource users, the resource stock, incomes per capita, and here we have it over time, so there's several periods. So we see here the resource users are constant for quite a while, and at some point they start leaving. The resource stock, right from the beginning is declining, and it starts leveling off once people start leaving the resource sector. And then the incomes per capita can basically explain us why people start leaving the sector. So this is the income in the resource sector, and these black points are the income in the other sector. So the income in the resource sector initially increases a little bit, yeah, so that's technological progress. But we start using the resource, so that is reducing income. So this effect becomes stronger over here, yeah. So then it dominates, income goes down, and at some point the income in the other sector via technological progress slightly increases over time. And at this point they're equal, so people are indifferent where to work. So some people start actually leaving the sector, and they leave the sector such that income developments in both sectors are on the same level. This explains then what's happening here. So if we now have regulation and we have zero regulation cost, just as a benchmark, assuming it just doesn't cost anything, what would we then see? That is the blue line, and the red one is as before. So the blue line says, well, initially we have the same, the number of resource users stays constant, but then they start leaving the sector, and they start leaving earlier than under open access. And the resource stock, it also starts declining when it's being used. But then at the point when the resource users start leaving the sector, it's also not declining anymore, the resource stock, but the resource remains constant. And you see it remains constant as a way higher level. So actually at the maximum economic yield level. And here you see with the income per capita, the income initially is slightly increasing as well, but it never starts to decline, because then people start leaving, and you see that actually here a rent is generated. Yeah, so now the income in the resource sector is way higher than the income in the manufacturing sector. But you see, as some people start leaving here, some people are actually earning this relatively lower income. So it's also kind of a question related to justice, that we can say, okay, I mean, maybe this is a good development for the stock. There's no use, like it's kept at a higher level, but we're creating some inequality here. At least if we're not, I mean, we could redistribute anything, but I mean, the way this is set up at the moment, we have a very unequal income when we have regulation and zero regulation costs. Here, incomes are just the same, but the stock is at a lower level. So what happens now if we have regulation cost? That is now the black line in here. So you see, initial number of resource users is constant, and then at some point, that is the point when regulation is introduced. So when benefits from regulation are larger than cost, the number of resource users is reduced, and it's actually set to a level lower than this zero cost regulation setting. And this is because of the monitoring cost. If we reduce the number of resource users that we allow, we reduce the monitoring cost. So that's why kind of this is even stricter than with zero regulation cost. But as you see, it kind of converges to the same level. And for the resource stock, we also see it's used longer and driven down to a lower level. But then once regulation is introduced, the resource stock recovers actually to a higher level than in this zero regulation cost case, and then slowly approaches this level. And these jumps are because that's kind of an artifact of our modeling, because in every period the resource recovers immediately. Yeah, so this is, I mean, usually you would see some more smooth transition. Here it's just this artifact. And then incomes per capita, you see similar. It's first increasing, then it's decreasing once regulation is introduced here. And we have even less people in the sector, so their income is even higher. We create even more resource rents, and we have this inequality between the incomes here. So that's also one remark here, that regulation leads to healthy fish stocks, but increases income inequality. And if we now look at these different cases and relate them to GDP. So basically do some Monte Carlo runs and compare it to what the different predictions are to what we saw in terms of the stylized facts. So we see that under open access with GDP, resource extraction increases, but then is keeping at some high level. With zero regulation cost, we also have the resource extraction is increased, but also then keeps at a constant level with increasing GDP. And only if we have regulation cost, we see this hump-shaped development that actually at low levels of GDP, resource extraction rates increase, but that at higher rates, they're actually coming down again. And in all cases, we see that with development, fishers are leaving the fishery. So that stylized fact is covered in all situations. We have some further results. Just like if the fixed costs are zero, regulation will always be introduced in the long run. So it will always be profitable. That means that on the other hand, if the fixed costs are too high, it may be that regulation was never introduced. That's also something to keep in mind. I mean, we can also think on land, if like a forest is very in the mountains, it's very hard to get there. It may just not be possible to enforce some regulation because it's just too costly. So that could be, and then we could also relate to the open ocean with the fish. We could also consider a case with different ecosystem services interlinked. I mean, now we just look at direct benefits of the fish itself, but there could be indirect benefits from the resource users. And then we would actually get an even higher stock in the case when we introduce regulation and an even lower number of resource users. And here we can also ask, is this just what we get here? Because it also will create a rent for the fishers, but then also again, from terms of ecosystem services for more or less everyone. Yeah, then we have some additional results. But let me come to the discussion and conclusion, and then we can maybe also have some discussion here. So what we did here is we present a dynamic model of a dual economy with manufacturing and a renewable resource sector, in which regulation costs decline with development. So we have this phase where we use the natural resource above the long run ideal level or the long run sustainable level. And then the introduction of regulation actually leads to resource recovery and to approaching the sustainable level again. And this development is driven by technological progress and by structural change. So technological progress leads to resource use beyond long run levels. Just resource harvesting becomes more and more productive. And then this leads to this, decline in productivity. And this fosters structural change. But then the structural change that people actually leave the resource sector on their own. This reduces regulation costs and makes regulation affordable. Such then with regulation enacted, we have the recovery of the resource. But if these costs are too high, especially the fixed costs, then it will not be efficient to introduce regulation. So if we think in terms of policy implications, so how can we actually support natural resource conservation, also nature conservation more broader? The first thing is to assign a resource manager. I mean, if no one is responsible for at least taking this decision of managing the resource or regulating the resource or not, then it will be open access. I mean, it could be a resource manager, could also be a community, but at least assign some responsibilities. Another thing is foster income alternatives. So if people leave, they could also leave so early that we'll never see overuse of a resource. And reduce regulation costs, especially these fixed costs. So I think with these ongoing technological developments, also in monitoring, this will also kind of make it, cheaper to regulate the resource. And this I would like, to put some questions for discussion and related to the baseline case. Regulation leads to income inequality. So what would be a just distribution of resource rents, for example? Or does a just distribution of resource rents and resource use rates matter for acceptance of a resource regulation, and thereby may even lower transaction costs because less enforcement is needed because people kind of fully support what is done there. So that's maybe interlinked. Yeah, and then if not only fish as ecosystem services considered, but also other services of the fish stocks or the ecosystem. So how should we then distribute regulation costs between different entities? Yeah, so with this, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this very interesting presentation. And perfect timing as well. So we have time for a good discussion and questions. So I'll open up the floor to anyone who's got any questions. You can use your